Before the Rings of Power, there were the Silmarils. Before Sauron, there was his master Morgoth. Before Aragorn and Arwen, there was Beren and Luthien. Join us as we explore Tolkien and all the ages of Middle-earth with your hosts from theonering.com, Jonathan Watson and Michael Grumbine.
Happy New Year, Michael.
Happy 2025, sir.
Yeah, this is the
listeners.
This is the fourth year, in a sense, of the podcast, because we started in 2022. So we'll have our third anniversary, but 2022, 2023, 2024, and now 2025.
So we started what month in 2022?
For first one was late May or early May, I think. I have to go back and look. I believe it was in May 2022. So our 3-year anniversary will be there, but it's our fourth date year. So
we're going to count them all, even though we haven't quite completed 3 years. So we're almost to our full 3-year anniversary.
That's right. And we are on a very deliberate 3-year pace through The Hobbit now. I mean, we took a full year to do the Silmarillion. We will take a good 7 or 8 months to do The Hobbit.
I figure because it took Tolkien 30 years to go from The Hobbit to the end of Lord of the Rings, it may be 3 years for us. It's not that bad.
That's a good point. It has, what's funny is that it's been, I think it was the 20th anniversary of Return of the King, I think, last year. Is that right? Or is it the 20? Hold on, I got to look at the dates.
Yes, I think it was the 20th.
2001, 2002, 2003, right? So yeah. So last year, or no, it was the 21st. So we are almost at the 25th anniversary. Next year it'll be the 25th anniversary of the Fellowship of the Ring. That's crazy. That's a long time.
Fellowship of the Ring movie, just to be
movie.
Clear, to our purist listeners like us.
Yes, right. Yeah, sorry. No. So that's 25 years. That's the amount of time pretty much between The Hobbit and the attempted edit for The Hobbit from Tolkien in 1961 when he tried to rewrite it. Yeah, so 24 years there. Anyway, I digress. We have an extended podcast we're going to get into today, guys. It will be we're going to get Michael's thoughts on War of the Rohirrim, because he was unable to stick with us last week. So my thoughts was that you make a movie about Helm and how Helm became a better leader of his people through the trials of losing to Wolf, retreating to Helm's Deep, the hunger and the disaster that they had to live through while they were there, while being besieged by Dunlending. So anyway, if you want to listen to that, you can become a supporter, a member of The One Ring by going to theonering.com/member. It's $4 a month. First month is free, or go to theonering.com/Patreon and become a member there too. That's $5 a month. And the first week is free, just because Patreon takes more money. And thanks to our sponsors, Lynn and Rich, who I believe Lynn was there on our Monday night call. You were there too, Michael, last Monday.
Yep. It was our end of the year live stream call, which is always fun to connect to our dedicated listeners and Discord members. So
yeah, and you do get access.
Anyone that wants to join the Discord and join us in a few months when we do it again.
Yeah, actually, we're going to try and do one again this month. We're looking at like January 20th. So we're just I was just like, people we would talk to them like, all right, guys, when can you do it again? And because we do have a reading group too that is going to start going through the C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy, and they go every other Monday night. I'm not a part of that. I used to be, but I couldn't continue on the Monday nights.
Okay, which book are they on?
They're just starting Out of the Silent Planet. So that's every other Monday. So we're gonna do it on January 20th. Otherwise, we'd have to go into February, and we're gonna try and do one late in February again too. So, all right, guys, theonering.com/member. Hope to see you there in Discord, and you can get their extended podcast too. All right. Hey, real fast. Okay. Hey, do you know how much War of the Rohirrim has grossed? Just real fast. Come on, worldwide. What? Take a guess.
More than $5.
You got it right. Thank you. Price is Right.
What about 30 million?
So far, we are at, what is that? 27 million. Not bad. 27 million. That's pretty much over
worldwide for weeks now.
For weeks, that's pretty poor. I guessed over 100 million. You guessed 200 million. This is nowhere near that amount. Nobody really wanted to see this. Nobody cared about it. So we'll talk about it.
It's fair to say this movie fell flat.
Yeah. Oh, really badly. Okay. But that leads right into today's. And this Hobbit fact comes thanks to Thomas from our chat on this past Monday night. Actually, based on when you're gonna, this is published, it'll be the Monday before the Monday because it comes out early Tuesday morning. But this is thanks to our member Thomas from there. Did you know, Michael and all of our wonderful listeners, did you know that The Hobbit and the Hobbit in 1977 and The Return of the King in 1980 from Rankin Bass was animated in collaboration with a Japanese animation studio named Topcraft? So this company Topcraft, they started doing some anime, and they were hired by Rankin Bass in order to do much of the animation. Like if you're watching on YouTube, like what you would see here, there's your Gollum in the Rankin Bass Hobbit. And this company, Topcraft, eventually went defunct. They went defunct in 1985, but their assets were bought by a new company called Studio Ghibli. Ghibli? Do you know how it's called?
I think.
Ghibli. And then Topcraft's founder, Topcraft, the company that helped animate The Hobbit here, they joined Studio Ghibli as their, I think, lead director, something along those lines. And then, of course, Studio Ghibli is known for Princess Mononoke, Spirited Away, Howl's Moving Castle. I still don't like anime, so I haven't ever watched all of those through the whole way, but I'm told they're very good.
Yep. I'm in the same boat as you. Not an anime fan, but I've heard that those are some of the good ones.
Yeah. So anyway, there's your first connection between Tolkien and anime. It was not War of the Rohirrim. It was actually the Rankin Bass Hobbit. Which actually, I'm really curious now. And looking at this picture, look at those orcs there. What did those remind you of? They remind me of something, and I can't think of it. I wonder what
Disney movie.
Yeah, what Rankin Bass's The Hobbit's box office was. Because
were they released in theater? Of course they were. They had to.
Yeah.
There was nothing else except no one.
Oh no, it was home video.
Oh, was
I didn't even know that. Yeah.
All right.
I wonder how much it sold. Well, maybe it would have done better, War of the Rohirrim, if it came out on home video directly, streaming instead of that.
It did end up on television a few times. I remember watching it when I was...
Yeah, it was an animated television special in 1977. Oh, I thought it was released as a film. Now, I think the Lord of the Rings by Rankin Bass was released as a film. Yes. Its box office at the time was $32.6 million, which $32.6 million, $1980 in 2024 dollars. So $32.6 million in 1980 money is actually worth $124 million today.
Okay.
Multiple of 4.
All right. So that, more than anything else, is the worst indictment of War of the Rohirrim.
Yeah.
The population, that your potential audience is exponentially larger, or at least geometrically larger.
Oh, it is.
You're on the back of... You're in a world where there's distribution across the entire world, not just the U.S. and whatever limited European markets they had it back in 1980. You are coming off of Peter Jackson's film, so everyone knows the IP, and no one else has done a Rohirrim-based anything. So it's not like there's the Marvel ennui and where people are tired of Marvel movies.
Yeah,
that's not going for you. And you can't even, you make less than 25% of what, I mean, who knows what I can't see them breaking 35 million if they're at 27 out of
and it's already out digitally for you to rent if you want to.
Which means that nobody's going to go to theaters anymore. So they probably won't even break 30 million. Unless there's another market that they haven't opened to.
No, and it looks like the original Lord of the Rings, and granted, this was, Lord of the Rings, 1980, people were more interested in seeing something that had never been done before, which is Lord of the Rings film and theater. So I'll give them that. But still, the amount of people in the U.S. is far higher. In fact, the movie, it looks like it was only released in the U.S. and the U.K., so there wasn't a worldwide a pool to jump into for them to to release this film, and they still could only make $27 million on this movie.
That's pathetic.
That's
Even
really
had
bad.
Jackson's name on it, and
Yeah.
Boyan's writing it, and wow.
Yeah.
So I have some thoughts. So join us in the extended edition.
That's right. All right, let's get into chapter 6 of The Hobbit. We finished chapter 5, Rills in the Dark, where we're all done with Gollum now in The Hobbit.
Correct.
And Bilbo has escaped. He left all his buttons on the floor of the back door, essentially, to the Misty Mountains. And he's all alone. Michael, do you have a quick overview for us of this chapter? We're doing the first part of the chapter before they get to the wargs. So we're not going to be talking wargs today. We're going to be talking everything up to the wargs.
No wargs. Everything up to the wargs. Okay, yeah. So the quick summary of the chapter, of this half of the chapter that we're reading today, is we follow Bilbo as he trudges his way down, and we get some descriptions of the Misty Mountains, or at least Bilbo's walking path. And Bilbo gets really worried. He doesn't know anything, hasn't heard anything from the dwarves, and Gandalf thinks they're probably back in the Misty Mountains and has just made up his mind to go back and reluctantly go back and look for them. See, that's how he has a magic ring. When he hears them and comes upon them, and they, in this funny parallel, are having a similar conversation of whether to go back and look for Bilbo. And Bilbo listens to it for a while, and then he jumps in, takes off his ring, and everyone's mightily impressed that he got past Balin and the lookout. And he tells them the story, and they have commentary, and then they tell him what happened. Gandalf does, who likes talking about himself. And then they set off again and head down the mountain, get caught in a landslide-ish, and sort of make it all the way down the mountain, or most of the way down the mountain, and then into the forest. And that is where we stop. So they're trying to get away from the goblins, who they think will set out after them at nightfall.
So the first thing that stuck out to me when I read this part of the chapter here on the first page is how I think Bilbo's success in the caves gave him even, it gave him even more courage, in the fact that the first thing that he does when he heads out is, right, he thinks of his friends, not that, oh my goodness, it's great that I've escaped, but he thinks of, like, where are they? What are they going to do? Do I have to go back and save them? And in fact, he does decide, I've got to go back and save them. He says, or Tolkien writes, he wondered whether he ought not, now he had the magic ring, to go back into the horrible, horrible tunnels and look for his friends. He had just made up his mind that it was his duty, that he must turn back, and very miserable he felt about it when he heard voices. Now that's courage, right? Doing the right thing, doing what you need to do, even though you feel miserable and frightened and scared.
Right. This is it is really true. People have said it before, nothing exciting to our listeners, but this is marking the sort of growth into maturity and virtue that Bilbo has, and adventure that he has throughout the rest of the book. And it's perhaps no accident that the ring is part of it. I don't mean that in the corruption of the ring from the Lord of the Rings sense. I mean that in the, he's won a prize from a monstrous encounter, and he's becoming a little bit more heroic. And so he's going to go back in by himself, I might add, to look for the others. And then we get to the others, and it turns out they're having the same discussion, and Tolkien really clearly gives us a hierarchy of virtue here, because Gandalf wants to go back in and save Bilbo, and the dwarves, it seems like, basically en masse, he doesn't call out any dwarves who want to go back. They basically all don't want to go back, and they complain about him and why he's didn't follow them, and essentially they're why Gandalf didn't do a better job of getting them a better burglar, and all kinds of, basically the dwarves are on the lowest rung of virtue here, because they do not want to go back, and basically they're going to be forced to, because Gandalf gives them an ultimatum and says, if you don't go back, I'm going to go without you, and then you're just going to have to deal with it without my help here. And then at that moment Bilbo appears. So they never have to make that choice, but clearly we have Gandalf, and then Bilbo, and then because Gandalf's he's not only is he not thinking about it, he's convinced he has to go back, and he has to drag along the crowd of dwarves with him. So he's working at that. Then there's Bilbo, who's struggling with fear, but then ultimately lands on virtue, next tier down. And there's the dwarves, who are in what we would call vice. They're cowardly. They're being disloyal and cowardly, and they're going to abandon Bilbo to the goblins without making any attempt to rescue him. So, that's Tolkien is really giving us a kind of clear picture of who's being the hero in these situations.
Exactly. Yeah, this establishes Bilbo as the hero and the dwarves as I don't know what they're not sidekicks. They're essentially like the weight that's dragging him down, in the sense like they don't even want him or need him. And even Gandalf, in a way, like he's like, he's my friend and not a bad little chap. At this point, they're still pointing out like Gandalf really didn't believe he was a burglar, in the sense that he kind of led the dwarves to believe the burglars. But he did say, "I brought him along, and I don't bring things that are of no use."
Right.
And so.
And the whole not a bad little chap, that's just an English phrase that, like, the English are the way they say they give praise is often backhanded compliments. And so saying he's not a bad little chap is actually equivalent from an American culture perspective of saying he's awesome, he's my friend, I'm going to go after him. So saying he's not a bad little chap is not like what an American would mean when he's using that phrase. So I don't see any hesitation on Gandalf's part, but you're right that he doesn't think of him as particularly like he's as a hero. Definitely not that. But he is going to go back for him, and he's trying to convince the dwarves to do the same. So it's an interesting juxtaposition of virtue between the three groups of characters. The Hobbit, the Wizard, and the dwarves. Yeah. Dwarves remind me in some ways here of the dwarves from Tolkien's friend Lewis in Narnia, who are a race of creatures. If you remember, Prince Caspian, for example, was when Lewis really gets into the different kinds of dwarves, the red dwarves and the black dwarves, and they are they're not very noble creatures. Even the good ones are kind of earthy and practical and suspicious and not very loyal to people that aren't dwarves. So it's there's kind of a common theme, and this is true in fairy stories too. Dwarves are not incredibly loyal people. I think Gimli, son of Gloin, or maybe a few of the dwarves, Balin, Fili, Kili, by the end of The Hobbit, but Tolkien really takes them up a few notches in virtue from the classical fairy story vision of dwarves, and but they aren't there yet.
Yeah, they remind me more of the petty dwarves.
That's right. Yeah. The petty dwarves, like Mime, or Mim.
Meme.
I don't know how you're supposed to pronounce it, but anyway,
I've heard. Meme.
Yeah, from the Silmarillion, right.
Yeah.
So anyway, this is the first time I think we mentioned before that Bilbo lies to them or doesn't tell them the full truth. So the later Gandalf ascribes it to and Tolkien to the influence of the ring over him. But
however, so how much did he lie if this were the first publishing of the Hobbit? He didn't really lie that much. No. Maybe he embellished his escape a little bit more, but it took what he did anyway. But yeah, so he didn't really lie very much. It's really only after the rewrite that the lie became written in stone, so to speak. Before that, it was actually him just relaying what happened.
Which again is Tolkien folding it into the world of the Lord of the Rings. And I mean that as the character, folding it into Sauron's world, where the ring is now an extension of him and it corrupts anyone it touches, slowly or quickly, depending on your strength, your internal strength. So I love his reaction. There's a very, very sort of early 19th century English moment when he snuck in, because of course he's invisible, and Balin and everyone, Gandalf, everyone's happy to see him, and then Gandalf immediately goes and criticizes Balin for not being a great scout, and Bilbo doesn't mention, of course, he was invisible, and so Balin says, "Well, this is the first time that even a mouse has crept along carefully and quietly under my very nose and up and spotted to Balin, and I take off my hood to you," which he did. "Balin at your service," said he. "Your servant, Mr. Baggins," said Bilbo. So there's this sort of like he's recognizing Bilbo's excellence, and Bilbo is being courteous about his recognition. A very, very early 19th century exchange there. Funny, made me laugh. And then we hear about Gandalf's side of the story, about what had happened to him. Turns out he had a couple blinding flashes. During the fight in which Bilbo got knocked senseless, he did another blinding flash, and it turns out his blinding flashes don't just blind; they kill, because the goblins keep dying from him. So I guess that's the third one, because the first one was in the cave, and the second one was in the Great Goblin, and the third one was in this tunnel fight. But one of the funny things I found, and it's funny on just two minor trivial levels, but was, and I had forgotten this except until this reread, even though I've read it however many number of times I've read it. I think I've read The Hobbit 14 times. But Gandalf says, the narrator says, evidently people had given up going that way. That was the way, the main way through the mountains. And the goblins must have opened their new entrance, that's the one at the back of the cave, at the top of the pass the dwarves had taken quite recently, because it had been found quite safe up to now. And Gandalf then says, I must see if I can't find a more or less decent giant to block it up again, said Gandalf, or soon there will be no getting over the mountain at all. So this is just funny, odd, like Tolkien just throws this in here, and I don't know if giants are ever mentioned again in Lord of the Rings, in The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings.
They are not. I looked it up because this is one of the notes that I had as well. And just so y'all know, Michael and I don't actually get together and talk about what we're going to talk about. But I actually had this note that the only other giant referenced is a guy named, and this is in the notes, not even in the Lord of the Rings, but a guy named Tarlang, a character in the Myth of Giants used to name some of the places in Gondor. But pretty much Tolkien had completely given up on the idea of giants, and this made me think about the stone giants are not. I don't think Tolkien meant them to be made out of stone. Actually,
no, they just live amongst the stone. They're called stone giants because
And so I don't think we brought that up even when we talked about. Did we bring that up? Because they're just giants. And so for Tolkien to say we got to get a giant, right? This is going back to he hadn't fully switched in a way to the change from it being just a children's story into it being a story of Middle-earth wasn't really even complete at this time. Now, maybe he had thought about giants. He hadn't finished Middle-earth, but there are no other giants in all of the Silmarillion. There aren't there in any sort of final rendition of any of his works other than this.
And on a very nerdy side note, since I mention it from time to time, in the Lord of the Rings online game that I play and my kids play sometimes, there is in fact a quest deep in the Misty Mountains where you can meet a giant, and the quest name is A More or Less Decent Giant.
Oh,
which is Gandalf.
That's
Gandalf's
great
phrase, which I thought was hilarious. So anyway, it was so the last time is mentioned in the text itself. Gandalf mentions a giant, and then which is interesting because it tells you that there must be at least have been some conversation, communication. Like Tolkien's assuming that Gandalf communicates with giants, like he's trapped, and that he would be able to convince a giant to block up an entrance like that,
and that generally the giants are not that decent. He's got to find one that's more or less decent.
Well, I mean, I think we got the picture. Giants are more or less not that decent when they're smashing boulders all around them.
That's a good point
in the crossing. But then they head off. And did you have anything else before they head off that you wanted to talk about?
No, I wanted to bring up, yes, that one, this is where Bilbo, in sneaking in, has essentially taken on the mantle of burglar now. He's now identifying himself. He's like, I just crept by you there, Balin. That's all. I didn't really do anything because I'm a really good burglar, and so he's changed that. But I think at this point too is where Tolkien kind of came into his own about the world that the characters are inhabiting. And this goes into the whole description. I mean, at one, it starts with, he points out that in the very beginning of this chapter that the sun was sinking westwards behind the mountains. It's italics here in my copy. Just making that point because now location is much more important to him. I don't think it was so much when they started their quest. He was just kind of writing, and they were starting their quest, and they rode over some hills, and there were some dells, and there were some large trees, right, and some shrubberies on the side, right. There was nothing of distinct character that he was really establishing in his prose when it comes to the world.
Right. There was no description of what you actually pay attention to if you're hiking through mountains and stuff. You know, the details like shadows and where the sun is, and then details about the flora. So for the rest of this section that we, to the middle of the chapter that we're going to go through, there's quite a description, and Tolkien sort of ramps up to it through a trope that's going to occur more than one time throughout the Lord of the Rings, which is Hobbit hunger, and how Bilbo's hungry. He hasn't eaten. Turns out, and Tolkien now also turns to time, so he makes it clear. You can almost, Gandalf tells them, "Oh, it was Monday night or early Tuesday morning when we were captured by the goblins, and then and now it's Thursday, and it's obviously Thursday near the end of the day." So we're talking 2.5 days that they've been under the mountains, closing in on 3 days in under the mountains and out and out again. And so we see Tolkien turning to very specific timekeeping here, which is a mark that he'll do throughout the rest of the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, and then very specific flora and geographic distinctions. So Bilbo complains about how he hasn't had anything to eat. Gandalf says, "Tough, tighten your belt, unless you want to be food for the goblins." And then they leave. And as they went on, Bilbo looked from side to side for something to eat, but the blackberries were still only in flower. So in other words, Tolkien's actually got a vision of what time of year it is. So blackberries are still in flower. Of course, there were no nuts. I mean, of course, that's only you only say of course if you know when nuts are available in the time of the year. Not even hawthorn berries. He nibbled a bit of sorrel, and he drank from a small mountain stream that crossed the path, and he ate 3 wild strawberries that he found on his bank, but it was not much good.
So essentially, he had a strawberry salad. That's what
that's right.
Sorrel, it just leaves,
exactly.
and a strawberry with it. So your standard,
but it was not much good. And they still went on and on. The rough path disappeared. And then he goes into this description of the flora. He says the bushes and the long grasses between the boulders, the patches of rabbit-cropped turf, the thyme and the sage and the marjoram, and the yellow rock roses all vanished. And they found themselves at the top of a wide, steep slope of fallen stones, the remains of a landslide. When they began to go down this, rubbish and small pebbles rolled away from their feet. Soon larger bits of stone went clattering down, and he describes the whole landslide. They kind of ride down and then get bruised a bit, but they escape the worst of it. And then he describes they slid into the edge of a climbing wood of pines that here stood right up the mountain slope from the deeper, darker forests of the valleys below. Some caught hold of the trunks and swam into the lower branches, and some, like the Hobbit, got behind a tree to shelter themselves from the onslaught of rocks. And then he talks about the bracken and the pine roots far down below. So he's really leaning into his description of the landscape, and it's even literally carrying the story, because it carries the hobbits down the mountain through a landslide.
I want to the highlighted phrases that I had that I think I didn't really come across as much or at all. I'd have to go back and assess in the first parts of the Hobbit, the first 5 chapters of the Hobbit that we read. Is that what you just read, where he talks about what it looked like as they went on and on? The rough path disappeared, the bushes and the long grasses between the boulders, the patches of rabbit-cropped turf, the thyme and the sage and the marjoram, and the yellow rock roses all vanished, and they found themselves at the top of a wide, steep slope of fallen stones and the rains of a landslide. So if we look at that prose and how he does it, right, he's describing the whole world as a great author does, in fewer terms. And so you have long grasses between boulders, right? Immediately you have this vision of it's a hard land. It's barren, but yet there's a little bit there. And what lives there? Well, rabbits live there because there's small bits of rabbit cropped turf. And so it's not a place that you're going to find large trees, right? Because it's just rabbit crop turf. They're just kind of hopping around. And then you get all the little tall weeds, essentially, thyme, sage, marjoram, and then yellow rock roses. And I think that this kind of a description of the land around a very specific flora, very specific even fauna and animals, wasn't there before in The Hobbit. And it's sort of like he decided, like, okay, now it's a novel. Now it's a real story. Now I have to actually make people feel like they're living in this world. And the same thing goes with the last phrase that you read. They slid into the edge of a climbing wood of pines that here stood up right up the mountain slope from the deeper, darker forests of the valleys below. I always love the phrase. I've noted this a few times. I'm not sure if Tolkien says it before. A climbing wood. It has that idea of sort of like as you're climbing up a mountainside and your fingers are sort of like gripping it and just barely holding on. That's what these trees are doing. They're just trying to climb the side of the mountain, just barely hanging on, but they're there, they're dark, they're tall, and as they fall down, it's like they're climbing to get out of that deep dark valley that they're in. And so in that phrase, Tolkien has one, you have this image of these crags, these boulders, these trees that are just barely hanging on, right? You have that vision of the roots that are sort of going over the edges of rocks and digging down deep, but the trees are actually in the dirt, they're sort of on the rocks. And then you have this vision of the trees are almost like they're trying to get out of the dark valleys below, the deeper, darker forests below. I love the way that he sets that up and the feeling that you don't really notice until you analyze it deeply, like how that one phrase is sub-creating inside your head this vision of what the trees not only look like, but what it feels like.
It's really true. And he continues with where we're stopping. Once they get down into the forest, it says they limped along now as fast as they were able down the gentle slopes of a pine forest in a slanting path leading steadily southwards. At times they were pushing through a sea of bracken with tall fronds rising right above the hobbit's head. At times they were marching along quiet as quiet over a floor of pine needles. And all the while the forest gloom got heavier and the forest silence deeper. There was no wind that evening to bring even a sea sighing into the branches of the trees. So he talks about the wind. Like it's his prose is so perfect in length. It's just long enough to give you the right description, and but not so long as, like, for example, our description of his world is much longer than his own description of his world. But we're building it. And it's funny because last night I had a conversation with my older children about a different topic, but then it led into the use of words. And one of my daughters brought up how Tolkien describes a mountain range as ominous. And that one descriptor brings, and my point was, he sparks the imagination. That's what he does. He doesn't paint a picture and say, the mountains ahead were approximately 5,000 meters tall with two peaks rising on the right side and a deeper shadow in the front and the glow around the detailed description of the tree line. And he gives you just enough to build it yourself in your imagination. And that's what makes it excellent, because you want, in works of fiction, you want the reader to build their imagination to be active. This is the difference between consuming a movie and reading a book, is that your imagination is active in the reading of a book, and in a movie, you're just being spoon-fed everything visually. Yeah. So anyway.
Well, it's what, right? It's harnessing the power of words to build a world based on your own experiences that is still completely new. Right. So you have experiences, you have seen things and experienced things, whether it's even through a TV show, or maybe it's through your own hiking and your own experiences going out into the world. But his ability to say, right, the climbing wood of pines above a deeper, darker forest of the valleys, right? All of us have kind of experienced that in some way, even if you haven't experienced it, you're creating it in some way. But those who have experienced it, right, you've seen that in certain places. Like right now, I think of when I was in Arkansas last year, that's the first thing I think of, where there was this valley that we went to at a state park where there were climbing trees up the hillside against boulders and stone that were just barren. And so that experience, right, that's sort of what I started imagining when I reread this time, that there are these areas in Middle Earth that resemble the world that I live in, but it's even worse and deeper and darker because now we're dealing with a landslide right there. But it's the marriage of the words with our own experience that truly subcreates within us. And that's why you said in films, you can't really do that, because it's not taking what you've already known and experienced and feel, right? Because those experiences aren't just visual. They're feelings. You have smells associated,
Right.
you have sounds associated with it. And so when he uses those words to create something that is a marriage of the words and your memories, it's more than just a vision. It's more than just a film.
Right, exactly. And so if you take 5 Tolkien fans who read the description of the upper mountains with everything that you talked about, including all of the herbs and the yellow roses and stuff like that, and then ending in the rock slide area, and then the carry down from the rock slide to the tops of the actual trees, and then down into the forest, and you read that whole thing, which is about a page, or 3/4 of a page. You do that, 5 people, 10 people who are fans, they all will find it an excellent description, but they'll have different pictures in their head because each of their imaginations works on it. There might be similarities between the pictures they build, but it's theirs. And that's the other thing about fiction and well-written fiction, is there's an ownership of it that is beyond even the ownership people take of movies and TV shows. The ownership people take of movies and TV shows is when you reach like a cult classic level, people find resonance with the story being told, or they find the jokes or the moments to be so inspiring, funny, amazing, that they kind of take an ownership of it, and they love the movie. For example, myself with Princess Bride, I love that movie. I memorized vast swaths of it, and it or Monty Python, or even the Lord of the Rings movies. But the ownership people take of good books is different because the images are their own, and they're not even the same images in their imagination as the images of another fan. And so when you really love a book series and you've worked your way through an awesome series and you've built the world in your head, there's a love to it that's abiding, that makes people even more serious. Like tomorrow I'm going to a Tolkien forum here in Southern California, and it's a you don't find a lot of, Tolkien forums and conferences and stuff are all, they're constantly happening on a regular basis, months, across the country, across the world. You're not, even of the best movies, you rarely find that happening. You might make the case for Comic-Cons or the cons of conventions where people go and dress up like they're Star Wars characters or something. But the idea of engaging both in an entertainment way, like you do at cons, or in an intellectual way, like forums, and papers written about him. There's just so much more ownership available to a well-written piece of fiction, a sub-created world, as Tolkien might say from his On Fairy Stories, that gives you so much more access, and people can own it in a way that they can't even with very good movies. So anyway,
this is why I disliked the films in the beginning, because I was afraid we'd all have the same vision of Middle Earth, which has sadly happened to so many people now.
Right. Right. And, like my conversation last night, we were talking about, like, when I was a kid, before the movies ever came out, my family would have arguments and debates about what Aragorn looked like, because Tolkien's description of Aragorn is spare. He has certain attributes that he talks about him being kingly and stern-faced and dark-haired and lean and lank. But besides, and there's a few others, but each person can really build their own. Nowadays, when anyone says Aragorn, people picture Viggo Mortensen. And I don't even fault him. Like, Viggo Mortensen did a good job. His voice is too high-pitched for my taste. But besides that, he did a pretty good job of Aragorn. And yet, by doing a good job in a movie, he limited people's imagination, which is
that's
kind of a sad thing.
His speech at the Black Gate,
that's the one where his voice was just
too it's just
way
wrong.
too high pitched.
It just didn't feel right at all.
No.
Only Gandalf saying for Frodo was good there at that. That was the added line that was fine by me.
Well, I mean, even some of the, there may come a time when the world of men fails. Like that.
I
I actually like that line. You may not, but I do. But he just didn't deliver it because his voice is too high of a register. It just sounded.
Well, that's okay, Michael, because he can redeem himself by doing the Hunt for Gollum, where they de-age him, and maybe they'll change his voice then completely in the next.
Yeah, I don't think they're going to change his voice.
No, I don't think so either. Well, they might have to if he's too old, just like they did with Harrison Ford.
His quavering voice.
Yeah. All right. Well, that was part 1 of Out of the Frying Pan and Into the Fire, Chapter 6. Next week, we're going to look at the last half of it. We'll get into the first appearance of wargs. Unlike the films that had them way too early and it was just dumb. So join us next week, Out of the Frying Pan, Into the Fire, the last half of the chapter, starting with the phrase, "Must we go any further?" said Bilbo. We're going to get into our extended podcast where Michael's going to give us his thoughts on how they should have filmed War of the Rohirrim. You heard mine last week. This is his time to shine. So guys, we'll see you on the other side.
Take care, freeloaders.